Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm preparing to feed a couple bins. The bins that are on target for getting fed today are the two that you see here on the right. The one on top is the older one of the two, 71 days of age today. And the one right below it, 35 days of age. They're both bins that I estimate to have about 5,000 worms in them each, and they're pretty hungry bins, that's for sure. They do away with whatever they're given. And so far I've not waited any more than 8 days between feedings on these bins. But on this go around, it's been 10 days now since they last got fed. And even though it was a pretty generous feeding last go around, there is that possibility that they might be running low at this point. So I've got some cantaloupe melon, I've got some used coffee. So we're going to get these bins up onto the bench today and give them a good feeding. So we're going to start here with the younger of the two bins, the 35-day-old bin. And you can see that the covering on this one, it's a sheet of cardboard with a plastic bag wrapped around it. So we're going to just make sure that we don't have any hitchhikers on there before we remove it. I don't see any worms on it, so that's good. I usually just worry about taking worms for a ride and having them crawl off the plastic and dry, although here we go, I did spot one. So let's get this little guy back in here. So this is interesting. I'm not sure if I've ever observed this many castings piled up on the top surface of any of my bins before, which is perfectly normal. It's completely expected in a bin that's got this many worms in it. Figure each of those worms is going to come up to try to take advantage of that moisture that's collecting on that plastic as it's attempting to evaporate. It comes up to that piece of plastic and condenses, and then the worms just come up for that. It seems they really do like that, and that's probably part of the reason you see so much activity on the surface. So 10 days ago, these bins got a fairly generous feeding right down the middle of a pretty good wide variety of different food items. There were some fruits, some vegetables, a variety of different carbon items. Some paper was placed in here as bedding. No grit though. The bin didn't get grit last time, so we're going to add grit this go around. But like we usually do, I try to take a quick peek to see how some of the food items from the last visit are progressing. So one thing I'm observing right here is what had been a block of rice. I took a little pint-size container of rice, white rice, from the takeout order from a couple weeks ago, sitting in the freezer, and I threw, I think, half of it in here. I broke the block of rice into two halves, and we're going to see a very similar arrangement of food in the other bin, because the other bin, for example, here too, this is half of an apple, so the other half of the apple ended up in the other bin. So I tried to make the two feedings pretty similar to one another by sharing certain things. There was also a loaf of bread, or no, maybe not a loaf. It was a roll. Yeah, it was a hard roll, which I think this might be what remains of it. It was a hard roll that had started getting a little bit moldy, so that came in here as food too. A lot of times you're just seeing me feed with kitchen scraps and stuff like that, but once in a while I put aside a slightly out of sorts food items such as the rice or the bread, things that I don't feed with very often. And it's those types of food items that I sometimes like to try to check in on to see how they've progressed over a week's time, or 10 days time in this case. The other thing that went in here with the food was a fairly large piece of, couple pieces of newspaper laid down under the feeding area as bedding. And I can't say I'm seeing many signs of that. Sometimes I wonder if that's really what they're most interested in eating. Okay, here we go. We've actually found some of it here. This was just some newspaper that had been crumbled up and thrown in here. I didn't go to the trouble of trying to shred it or anything like that. So there are definitely some scraps of it remaining, but not much, because from what I remember, it was a pretty good amount that I had placed in here. So I definitely see leftovers from previous feedings. You know, there's the rice, the half of an apple. This is the stem of a banana. This is the seed out of a mango, and they're working the inside of this mango seed for sure. We're seeing some leftover pieces of bedding, some of the paper that was thrown in here as bedding the last time we were in here. That stuff has been partially depleted too at this point. Definitely seeing some signs of it here and there. I guess this is, was this the apple? I've lost track. And then there's going to be a variety of other things in here. Who knows what? I guess this might be the shell of an avocado. So I've always got a variety of different foods that I'm giving these little guys, whether it's just leftover kitchen scraps from here or stuff that I'm bringing home from my mother's house or other places, different people contributing different things to feed to these worms. So there's always a plentiful supply of stuff around here to give the worms. And I was kind of looking forward to this feeding because my supply of stuff is kind of growing beyond my means of storing it. I've got just too much stuff in my freezer. So yesterday I fed a couple worm bins, or maybe what was it, one worm bin I guess, and today we're feeding these two, so that's luckily going to take a nice little bite out of my supply of worm foods. So I think we've given ourselves a nice little opening down here. And one thing I'm noticing here is that the material in this bin does seem to be getting pretty damp. And that's the one thing that we had definitely noticed in the next bin that we're going to be feeding, was that that one had also gotten quite damp. And it got so damp that we had decided it was time to remove the plastic covering from that one, to let it air out a little bit, let it try to dry off some. And I'm starting to wonder if that might be the best next step for this bin, is to exclude that piece of plastic that was covering it and cover with something that would allow for a little bit of evaporation of the bin, because I don't want things in here to get overly damp. And since one of the foods that we're adding today is melon, it's going to bring with it a fair amount of moisture as it starts to thaw, as it starts to get eaten. Got a little bit of casting material on my clean hand. Some of these pieces are actually just the meaty part of the melon, not even the rinds. So I'm sure that those pieces are pretty much almost all water. As they start to break down, they're going to add a lot of moisture to this bin. So I'm definitely not going to put the plastic on. I've decided that already. And hopefully that'll allow this bin not to get overly damp, like what we saw in the other bin that we're going to be feeding here. So I'm going to start putting some of these food items and bedding bits that we had located as we started digging down into the feeding area back down in here. Yeah, this stuff is definitely getting a little bit more damp than I would like. What else do we have here? Some seeds, some stems, some bits of bedding and other things. So I think we've got most of the food bits that we pulled out of the feeding area returned down into there. And I've also got a little bit of grit that I'm going to put in today. I skipped putting grit in last time, so we'll give them a little bit today. The grit I use is pulverized eggshell. I like to get it pretty fine. That's my personal preference. I'm sure the worms prefer it that way too. If it's too big to fit in their mouths, then what good does it do, right? Maybe it'll help keep the pH level in the bin at a certain balance, but as far as grit, it's not going to help the worms much if it's too big for them to fit into their little mouths. Okay, so I've applied about half of the melon that I bought down here today, about half of the coffee. We're going to leave the rest for the other bin. So I'm going to start piling up onto the feeding zone using some of the material from the sides, and at the same time use this as an opportunity to inspect how things look out here on the far reaches. And here too, I think I'm observing a little bit more moisture in this material than I would like to see. So yeah, I think leaving the plastic off here too now is going to help things. Even though it's damp, it does seem like it's going to break apart pretty readily. It doesn't seem like it's clumping and getting too muddy, which is a good thing. But I don't think it would take a whole lot more moisture for it to get that way. So I'm going to give this bin the chance to breathe a little bit better than it could with the plastic covering the top surface. Let's take a peek at how things look out here too. It's all pretty much the same throughout the entire bin. Considering it's only 35 days of age, it's just humming along. I'm definitely finding little bits and pieces, little scraps of the bedding that was used to originally build the bin. But one of the main ingredients for building the bin was leaves, and every time you use leaves, you're always going to end up with the little stems and sticks and the parts, the harder, more stick-like parts that make up the leaf. And they'll all get broken down too over time, but the leaves will have their softer parts eaten first, and then the harder, woodier parts will take a little bit more time to break down, and they'll all break down in time too. So I think we've got a pretty nice bin happening here. And I think it'll definitely do it some good to be exposed to the air a little bit more, just so it can kick off some of the moisture that's starting to pile up in here. And the castings look really great. Really nice stuff in here. It's pretty interesting when you compost with bins that have this many worms in them. So now in my other bin, when things started getting overly damp, I started to gradually reduce the coverings. I took off the plastic. But I mean, by being covered with the plastic, it's certainly not going to shed any moisture at all. So this will help a lot, I think, in letting some of the moisture escape from the bin. And you saw a lot of castings on the plastic I removed. I'll come back here later and scrape that stuff off back into the bin once it dries a little bit and it's a little bit more manageable. Right now it's just a little bit too damp. So things look really good in here for only 35 days. You got to admit, they're burning through whatever they're given. So let's move on to the 71-day-old bin. Alright, I can see now that I misspoke earlier. I think I had mentioned that I had removed the cardboard from this bin, but I had not yet gotten to that stage. I was thinking that that might be the next step if the bin is still too damp. But for now, we still have that kind of double layer situation going on here. Not only that piece of cardboard, but also this piece of paper. And now I remember what it was. I thought that instead of trying to use multiple different strategies to dry things off, we would try one thing at a time. So we stuck with the paper and cardboard coverings that had been on here, and we actually resorted to trying to use a great deal of dry leaves within the bin to see if that might help soak up some of the moisture in here. And the stuff is still pretty dry. If there had been plastic over the top, then the moisture would have tried to come up through the leaves to evaporate and would have gotten captured in here. We would have had much more damp leaves in here. This is that newspaper that I was shredding up to use as bedding in the other bin that we just fed. And we'll use some of that in here as well, but I'm going to also use this cardboard box just to scrape off some of this bedding from the top so we could reuse it. There's a lot in here. I can't believe how much I used. Hope it all fits into this little box. I'm sure the worms probably really appreciate all these leaves on the top. Being able to crawl up into a big pile of leaves. So now we've got pretty good access to what's right below the leaves. And the little tiny fragments will just mix in as we work our way into the bin. This bin would have also been fed down the middle with very similar food items to what we saw in the last bin. Except here I believe we probably added a bit more dry material, such as dry leaves. You could see a lot of the dry leaves and paper and stuff that was added to this in addition to the feeding, in the hopes that some of that stuff would soak up some of the excess moisture in here. Since this is where the feeding zone was applied, it's not unusual that it's pretty damp right down in here. I think it's when we get a chance to examine the outskirts of the bin is when we're going to get a better sense of whether the bin is starting to shed some of its moisture and dry off. I think as we open up a space to add today's feeding, we'll get a chance to see how some of the food items from the last feeding and previous feedings are coming along. Certain things take time. Stem of a banana, mango pits, whatnot. Other things get broken down a little bit more rapidly. After 10 days, they've done a pretty good job. Definitely finding plenty of worms hanging out down in the feeding area. And with the exception of the really slow composting items that we bumped into earlier, the seeds and the stem and other things like that, I'm not really seeing many signs of the previous feeding, not like we saw in the previous bin. In the previous bin we saw leftovers of the rice. We found a little chunk of the hard roll, but like the half apple, I'm trying to remember what else we had put in here last time. I'm not really seeing many signs of it. So it's making me wonder if this bin actually might have more worms in it than the other one. Or maybe there's something else that's helping spur on the rapid breakdown of all their food. Maybe the extra moisture. I mean, there's definitely more moisture in this bin than the other one. And maybe that's the only real key difference. And it might be the explanation as to why I'm seeing fewer leftovers from the previous feeding than the other bin had. That's interesting. Alright, so we've got ourselves a nice big hole over here. I think I am seeing a little bit of improvement as far as the moisture level goes. Since we were right in the feeding area, I did expect to see castings that were very muddy, kind of like they were last time, but they don't seem so much. And maybe it's just because there's a whole bunch of bedding material and other things mixed in with the castings right now. It's hard to say why, but maybe we're actually seeing some improvement here, which is a good thing. So let's dump in what remains of the melon that I bought down here for them. Almost makes me wonder if the other bin got more. Doesn't seem like a great deal. It does almost seem like the last bin received more melon, but whatever. Not a big deal. In fact, I'm looking at the coffee that remains. They might have actually received even more coffee too than this bin. So I don't know. I suppose maybe we can count all those leaves that we've got in here as supplement to make sure we can count both of these feedings as being equivalent, since there is just a huge amount of leaves that we're throwing in here. So I think just to feel more like I've given these two bins an equivalent feeding, I'm just going to throw a little bit more of this right down into the feeding area, and the rest of it will be used as top cover, which I don't really count so much as feeding. It's more of a bedding, I guess, but whatever. It's more or less all the same. Oh yeah, here's all the old food that I picked out along the way. Let's make sure that's all down here as well. I'm definitely curious to see how the bin is doing down low on the sides. A lot of mango seeds in this one. Be nice to see them start making some better progress on them. The mango seeds always take a long time, so you don't want to get your hopes up too much on those things. You just have to set your expectations appropriately, because they will take time, and you don't want to start holding your breath, because they're going to take a long time to get broken down, even if you break them into pieces like I've been doing lately. Okay. Pretty sure I got the majority of the food items that were in here. This is maybe more of a test object. This is the stem of a pumpkin. I'll throw that right in the middle so it's easier to spot next time we come in here. Alrighty. I guess I don't have to worry too much about leaving certain bits of food out on the top surface because all those leaves are coming back in here to cover things up anyway. But I'm definitely curious to see how things look on these outer edges, a little further away from where the food had been added most recently. Yeah, maybe a little bit more damp than I would want it to be, but not bad at all. Nice and crumbly. So I'm starting to think that the next step on this bin, even though it's on the road to recovery, I'd like to see that recovery kind of get there, you know, and be restored to a more even moisture level. I'm gonna exclude that piece of cardboard that was covering the top, that piece of pizza carton that you saw. And I think that would probably also help contribute to the drying off of this bin a little bit better. It's so cool digging around pretty much anywhere in this bin. You just see tons and tons of worms. Doesn't matter where you look, whether it's where they got fed last, whether it's in the far reaches of the bin, totally far away from where the feedings were occurring. There's tons and tons of worms in this bin. It's kind of been my theme lately. I've been trying to set up bins with large numbers of worms in them, but it limits my number of bins. Like I could probably be running 2 bins with the number of worms I've got in this container here. I guess the main advantage is that it just breaks things down very quickly and you sort of get done with the bin more rapidly. You can feed greater amounts and get to the top of the bin, fill it right up a lot more quickly with castings than if you had fewer worms. I'm wondering if I could just scrape that plastic from the other bin right off into here. I've given it a little bit of time to dry. Hopefully the castings will flake off pretty readily. So let's see if I can get this stuff to come off. I think if I left it a little while longer, it would get a little bit drier, a little bit easier to remove. So we got some of it off. We'll get the rest of it off later after things have dried off a bit more. So let's get back to covering things up. This is sort of an indicator to show where we last fed. We didn't really do this in our last bin. Maybe I'll just sneak back in there with a coffee filter to use that as a marker to show where this bin was last fed. I'm wondering if maybe we can leave this underneath the layer of leaves to see what becomes of it. That might be interesting. Nice consistency bin, maybe a little more damp than we want still, but almost equivalent to the first bin that we checked in on, the one that was still not overly damp, but just getting there. So maybe this one is finally steering back towards where we want it to be. And perhaps we can prevent from getting too damp by not putting this cardboard back on. So we'll just leave this off as well. So it's kind of a balancing act, you know, you're putting in moisture every time you feed. If you don't let it out, it's got to go somewhere. It's going to go into the castings. Maybe in the very beginning that's good, when you've got a bin full of a whole bunch of dry materials, a bunch of stuff that would benefit from remaining moist so that the worms can get at it and eat it. But once the majority of the bedding starts to get converted to castings like what we're seeing in these bins, it probably makes a lot more sense to allow all the moisture that comes in with the food to evaporate and escape as opposed to trying to keep it in the bin. So yeah, I'm kind of learning how to use these plastic covers. I just started doing so a few months ago, beginning of this year, so I'm still fine-tuning the approach, and I think I'm starting to come up with some pretty good methods for using it. Naturally, you don't really learn unless you make mistakes, so that's where I'm at, making my mistakes, trying to learn from them. Alright everyone, I got a little bit of cleaning up to do around here, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go, let me just say thanks. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. It's always really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.